Most people who try to grow a big watermelon end up with something the size of a basketball, maybe a little bigger if they got lucky with the weather. That's fine if that's what you're going for, but if you actually want a watermelon that makes your neighbors stop and stare, there's a specific set of things you need to get right, and almost none of them are complicated. They just aren't things most beginners know to do. I've pulled together 5 practical things that actually move the needle on watermelon size, based on what commercial growers and serious home gardeners consistently do differently. None of this requires special equipment or years of experience. It just requires knowing what actually matters. Before we get into it, if you're into gardening content that's actually useful instead of just repeating whatever's on the seed packet, go ahead and subscribe now. It helps a lot, and it means you won't miss the next one. Let's get into it. This is the part beginners skip, and it's honestly the most important decision in the whole process. Not every watermelon variety is built to get big. Something like a sugar baby or a crimson sweet is bred for flavor and a manageable size, usually somewhere between 8 and 20 pounds, and no amount of fertilizer or watering is going to turn one of those into a 100-pound fruit. If size is the goal, you need to start with a variety that's genetically capable of getting large in the first place. Carolina Cross is the classic choice for competitive growers, and it's the variety behind most of the record-breaking watermelons you'll see in news stories, often reaching several 100 pounds under ideal conditions. Other solid options for size include Black Diamond and Big Mo, both of which regularly produce fruit in the 50 to 100-pound range even without competition-level care. Buying the right seed matters more than people expect, and it's worth getting seed from a reputable supplier rather than whatever's available at a regular hardware store, since giant varieties aren't always stocked there. Once you've got seed that's actually capable of producing something large, everything else in this video is about giving that genetic potential the conditions it needs to actually show up. Watermelon roots spread out wide before they go deep, and a lot of home gardeners underestimate just how much space one plant actually needs. A single vine grown for a giant fruit should have at least 100 square feet to itself, sometimes more, because the plant is going to send out multiple sprawling vines and the root system underneath needs to match that spread. Cramming plants close together is one of the fastest ways to end up with a bunch of small watermelons instead of one large one, since the plants end up competing with each other for water and nutrients. Even if the vines look healthy above ground, overcrowding quietly limits what happens below the surface. Healthy roots need oxygen just as much as they need moisture, and when too many plants occupy the same space, the soil becomes depleted much faster. Instead of investing energy into producing 1 or 2 impressive fruits, the plants are forced into survival mode, constantly competing for the same limited resources. Giving each vine enough room isn't wasted space. It's one of the simplest ways to encourage stronger growth throughout the entire season. Soil matters just as much as spacing. Watermelons do best in loose, sandy loam that drains well, with a pH somewhere between 6.0 and 6.8. Heavy clay soil holds too much water around the roots and tends to compact, which restricts root growth and can lead to rot. If your soil is heavy, working in a generous amount of compost or aged manure a few weeks before planting makes a real difference, both by loosening the texture and by adding organic matter the plant can draw on through the season. Raised mounds are worth using too, since they warm up faster in spring and improve drainage, both of which watermelons respond well to. Warm soil isn't optional here. Watermelon seeds and young plants are sensitive to cold, and soil temperature below the mid-60s will slow germination and stunt early growth in a way that's hard to fully recover from later in the season. Applying a layer of organic mulch once the soil has warmed can also help maintain more stable soil temperatures while reducing moisture loss during the hottest weeks of summer. Mulch suppresses weeds as well, which means your watermelon vines won't have to compete with unwanted plants stealing valuable nutrients and water. Watermelons are made mostly of water, so it makes sense that watering is one of the biggest factors in final size, but the mistake most beginners make is watering on a random schedule instead of a consistent one. What the plant actually needs is steady, even moisture, roughly 1 to 2 inches per week depending on heat and soil type, delivered slowly rather than in one heavy soak. Deep, infrequent watering that reaches down to where the roots are doing most of their work is far more effective than a quick surface watering every day, which mostly just wets the top inch of soil and encourages roots to stay shallow. One easy way to tell whether you're watering deeply enough is to check the soil several inches below the surface a few hours after irrigation. If it's still dry beneath the top layer, the roots aren't receiving enough moisture, even if the surface appears wet. Deep watering encourages the plant to develop a stronger root system capable of handling periods of hot weather much more effectively. Timing changes as the plant moves through its growth stages. During flowering and early fruit set, consistent moisture is critical, since inconsistent watering during this window is one of the leading causes of blossom drop and small, underdeveloped fruit. Once a fruit has set and is actively growing, watering should stay steady and generous, since this is the period where most of the actual size increase happens. About 2 to 3 weeks before harvest, it's worth cutting back on watering somewhat, since too much water late in the game tends to dilute sugar content and can make the fruit less sweet, even if it's still large. Overhead watering is worth avoiding altogether if you can manage it, since wet foliage sitting overnight is one of the most common causes of powdery mildew and other fungal issues in watermelon patches. Drip irrigation or soaker hoses aimed at the base of the plant solve this problem and also waste far less water overall. Morning is generally the best time to water, since it gives the soil plenty of time to absorb moisture before the hottest part of the day, while allowing any splashed foliage to dry quickly. Watering late in the evening often leaves the area around the plants damp overnight, creating ideal conditions for fungal diseases. A consistent routine is usually far more important than chasing a perfect watering schedule, because watermelon plants respond best when they receive the same dependable level of moisture week after week. This is the step almost no beginner does, and it's arguably the single biggest lever for getting one large watermelon instead of several average ones. A watermelon plant left to grow naturally will often set 5, 6, or more fruits on a single vine, and the plant's limited resources get divided among all of them. If your goal is size, you need to intervene. Once a vine has set a few small fruits, usually about the size of a golf ball, choose the one that looks healthiest and most well-positioned, and remove the rest. This forces the plant to funnel essentially all of its energy into that single fruit instead of spreading it thin across several. Pruning the vine itself also helps. Once your chosen fruit is set, it's common practice among serious growers to trim back the secondary vines, sometimes called laterals, so the plant isn't spending resources on extra foliage and flowers that aren't contributing to the fruit you actually care about. Leaving the main vine and a reasonable amount of leaf area intact is still important, since the leaves are what produce the sugars that feed the growing fruit through photosynthesis, so this isn't about stripping the plant bare. It's about cutting the parts that are competing with your one fruit for resources rather than supporting it. Fertilizing a watermelon plant isn't a one-size-fits-all process, and using the same feed the entire season is a common reason plants underperform. Early in the season, while the plant is establishing vines and leaves, a fertilizer higher in nitrogen supports that vegetative growth. Once flowering starts and fruit begins to set, it's worth switching to something lower in nitrogen and higher in phosphorus and potassium, since nitrogen at that stage tends to push more leaf growth at the expense of fruit development. Potassium in particular plays a big role in fruit size and sugar content, so a lot of experienced growers lean into potassium-rich feeding once fruit is actively swelling. Calcium deficiency is also worth watching for, since it's the underlying cause of blossom end rot, which shows up as a dark, sunken patch on the bottom of the fruit and can ruin an otherwise promising watermelon. Working some gypsum or a calcium-rich amendment into the soil before planting helps prevent this, and consistent watering matters here too, since calcium uptake depends heavily on steady moisture rather than the total amount of calcium in the soil. As the fruit gets larger, physical support starts to matter as well. A watermelon growing on the ground can develop flat spots, or even split under its own weight once it gets into the 50, 60, 70-pound range and beyond, especially if it's sitting directly on wet soil. Placing a thick layer of straw or a wooden board underneath the fruit keeps it off damp ground and reduces rot at the contact point. Some growers build simple slings or supports for particularly large fruit, though for most beginners, straw and occasional repositioning is enough to keep things healthy. Rotating the fruit slightly every week or so, gently and without twisting the vine, also helps it develop a more even shape instead of flattening on one side. None of these 5 things are complicated on their own, but doing all of them together is what separates a decent-sized backyard watermelon from something genuinely impressive. Start with a variety that's actually capable of getting large, give it real room and good soil, water it consistently instead of randomly. Cut it down to 1 fruit per vine and feed it differently depending on what stage it's in. That combination is basically what every serious grower is doing, whether they're growing for a state fair or just for bragging rights with the neighbors. If this helped you out, do me a favor and hit like, share it with anyone you know who's into gardening, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Drop a comment and let me know what variety you're planning to grow this season, or if you've tried any of this before. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.